Do you love movies? So do I. What's up, y'all? It's KB, and I love movies, inviting you to listen to The Conversation, a film podcast where passion meets perspective and opinion. From the old school to the new, I invite a guest on to discuss the movies that thrill us, challenge us, break our hearts, or even blow our minds. There's always new episodes dropping wherever you get your podcasts. So join the conversation. We don't just watch movies. We love talking about them too. The Conversation with KB Loves Movies, a part of Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
Hello, filthy movie lovers. My name is Gentry Austin.
And I'm Casey Scott.
And we're the hosts of the Sin Syndicate, film podcast for something weirdos, anti-criterion bros, and Joseph Sarno aficionados. Join us semi-weekly as we peer into the adults-only theaters and sticky-floored cinemas of the golden age of sexploitation, when the morals were loose, the laws were murky, and the intercourse was all simulated. Find us now on the Someone's Favorite Productions podcast network.
What took you down the path of writing a book about Bob Clark?
Black Christmas, if you want to put it in two words. Mark, really, it's strange that basically my parents, but my mum specifically, was a huge horror film fan. So she used to go to every Saturday night. My sort of parents would go to one of the local Odeon cinemas in Peterborough where they lived at the time, because every Saturday night they used to do a horror double bill. And so when I was growing up and I got the sort of horror bug, she would always tell me about films she'd remember, but she would just purely go for the pleasure. She wasn't like an anorak like I am, where it's, well, I want to know who directed it and where did they film that and what was the budget for it and how much did it make on opening weekend? She was more like, I went to see this film and it was amazing. And that's all she cared. She didn't care who directed it or who was in it. But so she would always go on about these films that she'd seen that, you need to watch this one when you get a chance and you need to watch that one when you get a chance. But she could never remember the titles of these films. So she would always go on about, because this was pre-internet. So I think all I had at the time was Halliwell's Film Guide and various horror encyclopedias. And she would always go on about this film. She said, right, it's a film and it's about these girls, that university students that are in a house and they keep getting these phone calls. And it turns out that the guy's in the attic of the house and there's a rocking chair. And I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about, Mum. I don't know this film. This doesn't ring any bells for me. I haven't seen this film for sure. I'd mention it to other people and they'd be just having blank expressions. And then once when I was working at HMV, which is like a music and video retailer that I did when I came out of uni, I was just casually mentioning this to one of the other staff there. And he was like, that's Black Christmas. And I'm like, what? And he was like, yeah, that's a film called Black Christmas. And it wasn't available in any format at that time. So this was mid-90s. Wasn't available on VHS. It wasn't available at all. So I just did a little search in the local library and said, well, yeah, that sounds like it's the one. Attic, phone calls, students, that sounds good to me. And then lo and behold, when I was working about a year or so later, I was in the store and I didn't work with that member of staff anymore because I'd moved to a different store. And suddenly the fax machine, so here we go, I'm aging myself there. The fax machine whirred into life. And this fax just came through and all it said on the fax in massive letters was Black Christmas, Channel 4, Christmas Eve, 11:30. And then about 20 exclamation marks. And I was like, well, I don't believe this. So I thought, I'll watch Black Christmas. I thought it can't possibly be as good as my mum is making out, but I shall watch it and we'll see what happens, sort of thing. And indeed, I didn't think it was as good as my mum made out. I thought it was better than she'd made out, because I just sat there and I thought, how is this not held up as an absolute iconic horror film? It has everything, so much stuff in it that was done for the first time in that film. whether it be like Steadicam or sort of stuff like that, the killer's point of view and the ending and everything about it, the soundtrack, just everything about it I loved, basically. Not long after that, thankfully, it then got a VHS release through a company called Tartan. I don't know if they ever did anything in the States at all, but they did it on VHS, and then it came out on DVD, and suddenly then everybody realized what an amazing film it was. And Bob Clark started being heralded. I just went on a bit of a Bob Clark binge from there, really, because straight after Black Christmas got released, the same company then released Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things on VHS. Again, aging myself here, but I think we're similar ages, Mark, so you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, yeah.
The good old VHS days, praying that the tape didn't chew when you sort of took it out of the machine. And so I watched that and I thought, well, that is a radically different film to Black Christmas, but still as enjoyable in its own way. Yeah, so then you can just sort of fast forward 20 years, if you like, when I started getting into film writing, like writing for film magazines and stuff like that. And I then had my own site. And I just sort of went to the sort of publisher of a couple of the magazines that I write for and just said, well, they were looking to start this series of books on directors, not full on massive tomes, but like a sort of halfway house book. So not a pocket book, but, 35,000 word jobs. And my first suggestion to them was, well, can I write a book about Black Christmas? And they just came back and said, no. They didn't think there was enough value in a book just on Black Christmas. And so I'm like, right, well, I'm determined to do this. So then I thought, right, well, hang on. What about if I do a book on Bob Clark? Because you've got Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, you've got Death Dream, you've got Murder by Decree, you've got Popcorn, you've got the Black Christmas remake, as well as all the other stuff he did in between. And so I went back to them with that suggestion and they were like, yeah, actually, okay, then that could work. So hence I then plowed through this book called I'm Going to Kill You, which is what it's called, because I think if you remember well, that is what Billy says on the phone to Margot Kidder in Black Christmas on his first phone call, when he just does all this ranting and raving, and then he just really calmly and chillingly at the end just says, I'm going to kill you, and just puts the phone down. And I thought, well, there you go. And so that's how it happened, really.
During your research, you obviously explored the films that Ormsby and Clark did together. So I'm curious about how they got together, how, where, and when they met.
Mainly in Florida, through a love of theatre, really, how they sort of met. I think Alan's 4 years younger than Bob. I mean, Bob's sadly not with us anymore, but Alan is. And Alan's 4 years younger than Bob. So I think Bob or Benjamin Clark as he was born, because that's the credit on Children, isn't it? It's by Benjamin Clark and the director credit. He was born in 39. I think Alan was born in 43, but they were from different areas, but they both ended up in Florida. People, again, still now seem to consider Bob Clark a Canadian director when you talk to a lot of people. And that's mainly because he hit the big time after he moved to Canada. But Bob was actually born in New Orleans. And then his dad died and his mum bounced around with jobs. And he eventually ended up in Fort Lauderdale, which is where Bob grew up. And Alan was in Florida as well. And I think they both ended up in drama school through like the University of Florida, University of Miami. And that was it. There was no intention for films from them. I don't think there was a film school. I think Bob said at the University of Miami didn't have a film school, but it had a drama school. And so they were very much theatre when they met. And in fact, there was a whole host of people that were in that drama group, at that drama school, that just stuck together. So certainly in terms of Children, you've got Bob Clark was there, Alan Ormsby, Carl Zitra, Gary Gotch, Jeff Gillen, Valerie Manchez, Anya Cronin or Anya Ormsby. They were all students together at this drama school. And they did Shakespeare and they did all sorts of things. And so that's how they met. They were just friends with a love of theatre, really. And they went their separate ways. Alan stayed in theatre. Bob directed some theatre stuff in the Florida area, and then got the bizarre stories that come from these tales when you look back at the way films were made in this time. But Bob, somebody went to one of the plays he was directing, like an Arthur Miller play, I think, and then just basically came up to him outside the theatre and said, I've got some money. I want you to make a film for me because I think you can direct it. And basically Bob was like, well, I've never directed a film in my life. I've never even held a camera. You know, what are you talking about? And it's like, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. We've got this World War II photographer who's going to be the cameraman. And I've got this studio that apparently in this one studio, it was a funeral parlor, a tomato canning factory, and a film studio in this one building with this guy called Charlie Brune. And he basically said, look, I've got a bit of money. I want to make some very, very quick exploitation films. The first film that Bob actually made was this absolutely incredible film, I think 66, 67, called She-Man. Now, I'm presuming you haven't seen that, Mark.
That one I have not seen.
No, I don't think I've ever met anybody else that has. If you do watch it, you'd understand why that was the case. It is one of these almost Ed Wood-esque gender movies, like somebody you think is a woman is actually a man, and they're blackmailing somebody who used to be in the army, and they're blackmailing them because nobody knows they deserted from the army. I mean, and it's the whole film was filmed in like 2 days, I think, at this house with a pool, and it's just the most amateurish thing you've ever seen in your life. But it still got released. You know, it got released at drive-ins, and Bob said he just didn't have a clue what was going on. He said, you know, this cameraman was doing this. Bob said he literally had a book, so like how to direct films, that he had with him. And it was just like, well, do this, do that, action. And that was it. I think the quote Bob actually said was, it wasn't a case of sink or swim. It was a case of drown and then see if there's any way you could recover. It was that bad. But the bug took him. He enjoyed it. And so immediately after that, he then made another film for the same guy, which has never been released, called The Emperor's, like a version of The Emperor's New Clothes, which bizarrely had John Carradine in it. Although John Carradine seemed to appear in like millions of films, so maybe It's not that surprising that he was in it. Then Bob stepped into then producing some more exploitation stuff. There was a film called Shanty Tramp, you know, which is just pure exploitation. There's rednecks, there's biker gangs, there's racism, prostitutes. It's just unbelievable, that film as well. And so by the late 60s, though, I think Bob had sort of thought, well, this isn't really going anywhere. You know, I'm bouncing from no budget exploitation film to no budget exploitation film. And is this what I want to do? I'm enjoying filmmaking, but not really sure this sort of filmmaking is what I want to be doing. He met up again with Alan because of Alan Ormsby and Bob were good friends. And they went to see Night of the Living Dead, the Romero classic. They went to see it at the movie theater, and they basically came out dazzled and said, right, we need to do something like that, but different. So rather than full on in your face horror from first second to last second, they wanted to make a zombie film that was funny as well as getting the gore in at the end. So they very much wanted to do something. You know, they said they wanted the gut ripping, but they wanted people to have a laugh with it as well, which I don't think many people laugh. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but I can't remember many people laughing during Night of the Living Dead.
It's a little bereft of humor.
Yeah, exactly. So they said, well, let's just do it. They sort of sat and wrote a script. Bob basically wrote it in 10 days, I think in somebody's house he was living in South Miami. Then he gave it to Alan and said, look, can you just give this a bit of a polish, put some extra dialogue in? So I think Alan says he wrote the incantation sequences, you know, that there are in the film where he's doing all these spells and animation curses and all this sort of thing. But Bob wrote it in the main. Alan had a love of makeup, which you probably know. You know, Alan Ormsby loved horror makeup and special effects and stuff like that. So it was like, well, I've written it. You can take care of the special effects. We just need to get some money now. And so they went to the Gotch family. Gary Gotch was one of that was at university with them, and also Ken Gotch. But they went to their parents who had a bit of money to spare and basically said, look, we're thinking of doing this film in the area, in Florida, in Miami. Can you give us any money? And they did. And then they also had this Canadian company called Quadrant, who had somehow seen the script and liked it. So they got on board. And then also Ted V. Michaels, who, again, you probably, listeners and yourself, is probably aware of, you know, another exploitation legend for like what corpse grinders and Astro Zombies. And what he got involved as like an exec producer sort of thing, who would take care of the distribution of it. So suddenly they went from just having this idea to suddenly having a budget, and it was very low budget. I don't think anybody's ever given me the exact budget. I've gone from somebody telling me it was 25,000 up to Michael saying it was 100,000. It's probably somewhere in the middle. Bob said 40,000, but still nothing of a budget. So what it meant was they couldn't really bring in any known actors or anything like that. What they came up with, and I thought this is ingenious when you actually watch the film, is they just used their drama group. So you suddenly had all those people I listed earlier. Alan Ormsby plays Alan in the film. Jeff Gillen plays Jeff. Anya Ormsby plays Anya, and suddenly they're all in there. They're all dramatic. They're all actors because they're all done drama and theatre, but they've known each other for years. And so suddenly they're making this film, Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. One of the reasons I think it works so well is because you buy that these guys are a group, rather than they're these random actors thrown together on set meeting for the first time. They all knew each other. So you add that real ensemble feel to it. And also, if you're doing a film with a bunch of friends, you get a lot more leeway, don't you? Rather than if you've got some stuffy actor coming on with their demands. Right. If it's all like, well, we're all a bunch of mates, let's just have a bit of a laugh and make this zombie film, and it's going to be a bit difficult, but let's just get on with it. They were able to do that.
That is the one thing for me, knowing that they knew each other. It sort of explains a question I have in my head as I watch it. It seems like for a low budget film directed toward the exploitation market or the drive-in market, let's say, that it either was brilliant improvisation or tons and tons of rehearsal time. Now, you can rehearse for free, obviously, without the film rolling. But I think that explains it even better, is that these people had worked together so much before, because that's the one thing that I think separates this from a lot of low budget films is the acting. It's not award-worthy acting, but no one's fumbling over their lines.
No, exactly.
The deliveries aren't stilted. It's not that typical low budget, let's shoot this real quick acting. It's definitely at a higher level when you consider the money and sort of what they were going for. And that is one of the things that helps elevate this.
No, I agree with you completely. It's the former rather than the latter. Did they rehearse or was it something where they were just thinking on their feet? It's certainly the thinking on their feet element, because, and this happened throughout Bob's entire career, the amount of people that I read from films, and even when we're talking films like Murder by Decree, where we're talking millions budget, I'd still be interviewing actors that had been in these films, even like lesser actors, not like the Plumbers and the James Masons and stuff like that, but that just people that had smaller roles. And they were like, Bob would just come up to you and say, right, well, this is what's written, but what do you think your character would say in this situation? And they were like, well, actually, they probably wouldn't say what you've written there. They're more likely to say something like this. And Bob's like, well, then say it. That's what you think. If that's what makes it more believable, then say it. And so I think time and time again, I heard this when I spoke to people that had worked with Bob, were just saying how loose is maybe the wrong word, but just how he let everybody have their say. Alan appreciated that, certainly. I think Alan said when he worked on this first film with Bob, he thought he was going to come on set, and because Bob was the director, that it would be, you do this, you stand there, you say this, you stand this, and I say cut. But whereas it was like, well, this is very much a group effort here. So I'm behind the camera, but if you've got an idea, I want to hear about it. And they were able to just wring every penny out of that budget. That they filmed it in 2 weeks. They basically shot it at a nursery. Dade County Nursery was what they converted into the cemetery / graveyard. And they did that because a whole host of people, for nothing really, went over a week before filming started and dug graves and put these styrofoam headstones in, and they dug holes in the ground and put like a seat in the hole. So basically all these actors that were playing the zombies would just sit on this seat, then be covered with a layer of soil. And so when it was time to come out the earth, they just stood up. All this stuff. They had smoke machines. They were absolutely riddled with mosquitoes while they were filming this.
I can imagine in Florida, that would be an issue.
Yeah, because it was done in summer of 71 was when they filmed it. I think it was August 71. And so you can imagine what the weather was like. They were filming 20-hour days because they were filming through the night. Because, you've seen the film, it's practically completely set in darkness. So they were filming through the night. They were long old days. There were people sat in makeup, mosquitoes. They were having to ferry into this island sandwiches for people, but they could only afford sandwiches that were a day old. So like Alan was saying, they were bringing in like meatball sandwiches that were from the previous day. Everybody put up with it because they were so excited to be doing it. None of them had done a film before. And all these people, like the boat they use, where you see them sailing over to the island, and then you have this Fulci-esque sequence at the end, and where all these zombies shuffle onto the boat to head to Miami. That was a lawyer that was a friend of theirs. It was his boat. And so he said, well, look, you can borrow my yacht, and then, we'll make you one of the zombies. The house, the cottage they use in the film, where they get besieged in this house, that was the still photographer's actual house. That was where he lived. And they just sort of dirtied it up a bit to make it look as though, put a few boards over the windows, and it looks as though it's abandoned. It was very much filmmaking on the fly, making the most of what you've got, having a group of people that really wanted it to succeed, and talented people as well. I watched it again, ahead of this podcast. I still love it. Yeah, I've seen plenty of films that are better than it and more professional, but is it entertaining? Yeah. Alan Ormsby's performance in it is worth watching just for him, isn't it? I mean, he's practically twirling his moustache every line he delivers. And that's not even before you get into the fashion that's on display with like the cravat and the silk shirt and those striped pants.
Lots of stripes.
It's just an incredible film in terms of how it flips, because you get that first hour, which is played for laughs, really. You get an openly gay couple in there, which I think that can't have happened many times in horror films, certainly American films to that stage. You've got all these memorable characters, and it's all a bit comedy, a bit slapstick, isn't it? You get Jeff Gillen saying, I mean, goodness knows how many times he says, I peed my pants. But then suddenly you get hang on a minute, that spell's actually worked. And you get 20 minutes of people being ripped to pieces and this house under siege, Night of the Living Dead style, but it's effective. The soundtrack is like nothing else I've ever heard, certainly at the time. These weird noises and sort of everything else that Carl Zitra came up with. But it's not a unique film, but it's quirky, in a very good way.
It's one of those films where what should have been detrimental to a production sort of ended up giving it its charm. I absolutely adore the film and agree that what elevates it is that level of having worked together, plus being able to turn mistakes into your bonuses, or not necessarily mistakes, but your shortcomings kind of become.
It makes it lovable, that's the thing. And then you throw in Alan's performance. And I mean, it's like rarely have you wanted to see a character get their comeuppance so much in any film before or since.
He is one of the best assholes, for lack of a better word, in a horror film that I can think of.
To the extent where he even throws his wife at the sort of zombies in a sort of way to sort of get away.
Yeah, man, that's brilliant. I'm curious if you know this. I'm looking at you mentioned the Movie Monster book, or his love for makeup, and I have his Movie Monster book. I bought a new copy of it because it was something that I adored as a kid. And I was looking at the pictures in the chapter that you had sent over. And among the pictures is the poster that I think, if anybody's familiar with the movie, they're familiar with the poster, which I think is a perfect representation of the film itself. But I'm curious to know if did Ormsby do the illustration for that poster?
I couldn't say 100% for sure, but it wouldn't surprise me if he did. Are you talking about the, it's Orville's coming out party? That one with the balloons and
it's the illustrated one. So
like the cartoon one of them almost.
Right, because it looks a lot like the illustrations in the book. Which
I wouldn't be surprised because one of the things listeners might not be aware of is after Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things got released, then there was a situation where Bob and Alan enjoyed working together so much, but they were still at a bit of a loose end because it's like, well, what do we do now? First of all, they talked about doing a sequel called Children Still Shouldn't Play with Dead Things. So they predated I Still Know What You Did Last Summer there by a good 30 odd years. That was swiftly said, no, that's not going to happen. So they ended up working for this company called Europix, which were a company, like an American distribution company, basically hoovered up all of these European horror films, dubbed them, and gave them a new title that was more palatable to the American market, and then bunged them into the drive-ins and theaters because they hadn't paid anything for them. They just got, and so make a quick buck. What they wanted was new artwork for these films, new posters. And so what Bob and Alan did was they worked for Europix, and Alan did a whole range of these posters for like Revenge of the Dead, and with like peeling corpses' faces, and no relation to the film whatsoever, but like the good old days of seeing a VHS sleeve at like your local rental store and then getting home and saying, well, hang on, what's that got to do with it? But it was a way of driving some business. One of the things they did do, which was amazing, was Bob and Alan went and filmed this like skit almost really with this guy, with this actor that they knew called Victor Bumbelow, which is a fantastic name, isn't it? Victor Bumbelow. They did this film with him where he was supposedly this guy called John Allen Fraser, I think, or that was his name. And he had apparently watched one of these films and it had driven him insane because it was so horrific. So they did this skit with this guy being like put in a straitjacket and like sort of being carted off, which they would play at the drive-ins to say, well, come and see this film for yourself next week because we've got Revenge of the Dead playing. Will it drive you insane? So that's what they did to sort of almost like tread water, if you like, because Children did the rounds for a long time. Sort of was showing in late 71 in places, and 72. It did drive-ins, it did theaters. Alan remembered going to see it at a cinema somewhere, or a movie theater somewhere, where they actually had some like people dressed up as zombies on like a lead that he was walking outside the theater. Pure William Castle sort of stuff. And yeah, I saw evidence that it was on a triple bill in July 72 in the States at a drive-in with Argento. I think it was like Cat o' Nine Tails or something. It was on a triple bill with that. And I think it didn't even get to Canada until 73. So these films had quite a shelf life back in those days, when it wasn't you're in a theater for 2 weeks and then you're gone, and then you might turn up on streaming somewhere. These films would just be years afterwards, just sort of popping up somewhere. And Children ended up making quite a bit of money. I mean, when I read in, not a tremendous amount, but I read in Variety from the time that in 72 it was being quoted as having made $1 million. Well, if that's a film that cost $40,000, wow, $40,000, and it ended up making $1 million, well, that's quite a nice return, considering it didn't have a tremendous amount in the way of marketing, and it was a springboard for them. Suddenly, it was a calling card. Bob had a film that he didn't want to ignore it happen because he pretended that like She-Man and the films like that had never happened. Was openly saying that he would tell people, the first film I made was Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, not She-Man or Shanty Tramp. It was a good calling card. People were interested in working with them because they got absolutely every dime and cent out of that money that they had.
Hello, this is Chris Haskell from They Live by Film. For those that don't know us, Adam, Zach, and I, we built a podcast over the last 2 years that's a combination of film discussion from 3 very different perspectives, as well as industry interviews with the leaders in boutique Blu-ray and 4K community. We started with Dev Crocodile, but over time we've been lucky enough to speak with Arrow Video, Severin, Mondo Macabro, Vinegar Syndrome, Radiance, Indicator, most of the OCN partner labels. It's been a blast. You can find us wherever you podcast, and also actually recently as part of Someone's Favorite Production Podcast Network. We hope to see you online.
Are you a film fan who loves the ultimate home video experience? Look no further than The Disconnected. Your host, Ryan Verrill, is your go-to source for the latest and most accurate information on home video releases, exclusive interviews with industry insiders and filmmakers, and has established a thriving community where every film and physical media enthusiast feels welcome. From hidden gems to blockbuster hits, The Disconnected brings you insider knowledge and a welcoming space to share your love of cinema. Watch every Thursday night at 9:30 Eastern, 6:30 Pacific for the live announcements show and follow The Disconnected on social media to stay updated. Subscribe to The Disconnected on YouTube or on the podcast provider of your choice and dive into a world where every movie night is an adventure.
Quickly after Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, Ormsby and Clark team up again for Death Dream. That wouldn't see the light of day for a little bit. Deranged actually came out next. It's kind of like Abbey Road and Let It Be, where Let It Be was recorded prior to Abbey Road, but Abbey Road came out prior to Let It Be. So it's sort of that, this is their late Beatles stage, I guess. What is part of the reason for Deranged coming out before Death Dream?
Bizarrely, there was this huge gap between Death Dream being filmed, but it actually getting released. It seems strange to me because I know you appreciate Death Dream as a film. I think it's an absolute gem of a sort of horror film on so many levels. It had a much bigger budget. It had recognized actors in it, but for whatever reason, they struggled to get distribution. So although Death Dream was filmed in autumn 72, it didn't actually get released until August 74. So you're talking the best part of 2 years after it actually was made, because they had to do reshoots on Death Dream as well, which was unusual for Bob. Usually they didn't have time or the money for reshoots. But because Quadrant, who liked children, and so said, right, well, we'll bankroll you to make another film, and we'll give you $235,000 was the budget for Death Dream, they had a bit more of a say in it. There was more interference, is a simple way of putting it, on Death Dream, that there was more people they had to answer to, and there were reshoots. Actually, Bob was editing the final version of Death Dream on the set of Deranged. Deranged was filmed late 73, and it pretty much was filmed and released instantly. I think it was February 74 that Deranged was released, and it had an unbelievably limited release. From my personal understanding of it is I think one of the reasons was, in their wisdom, they decided to tack on a subtitle to the film. I don't know if you're aware of the subtitle. You might ring a bell when I say it, but they subtitled it Deranged, Confessions of a Necrophiliac.
That's how it's presented here on streaming with that title.
So I think when they were suddenly going to drive-ins and movie theaters and saying, look, we've got this film. Are you interested in showing it? What is it? Confessions of a Necrophiliac. It was a bit of a hard sell for them. So I think that's why it practically came and went in February 74 with very little in the way of release. It didn't tour the country. It was, in fact, completely forgotten about until a years later that somebody found the negative somewhere and then said, what's this? Hang on. And then they were like, yeah, we've sort of buried that film. And somebody watched it and said, why on earth have you buried this? It's incredible. It's very powerful and incredibly effective at what it does. And then it got, again, the whole re-release treatment and reappraised and reappreciated, or appreciated for the first time probably. But the other thing was with Deranged was they were dealing with a different money man. So with Deranged, it was this guy called Tom Carr. He was a concert promoter. He worked with like Led Zeppelin, bands like that. So he was quite high up in the music industry. But for whatever reason, he fancied making a film, a quick film on the side, just to say he'd done it. He'd seen Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, and was another person that loved it, met with Bob and Alan and Jeff Gillen, and basically said, right, I want to make a horror film. I've got 200 grand that you can have tomorrow. What can you make? But you've got to do it quick. Tom Carr threw in Ed Gein as well he liked Ed Gein, maybe likes the wrong word, but had an interest in Ed Gein. And so Alan Ormsby basically said, right, okay, well, I'll write a script that, other than literally calling the character Ed Gein, is about Ed Gein. Ezra Cobb is his name in the film, isn't it? Robert's Blossom. But it's Ed Gein. The tyrannical mother, it's the killing a couple of people in the local store, it's the corpses, it's the furniture. It's everything we know about Ed Gein written into a story that's not called Ed Gein. The original plan was Alan Ormsby wrote it and would do special effects on it alongside Tom Savini, who I'll probably mention a bit later on when we go to talk about Death Dream.
Mm-hmm.
But the original plan was Bob Clark was going to direct it. They were making this in Canada. Quadrant, who had bankrolled Death Dream, were a Canadian company. And so they asked Bob to go and edit Death Dream in Canada. They wanted him to work in Canada. So hence then Deranged ends up being filmed in Canada at this place called Oshawa, which is about 60 miles from Toronto. And it was filmed in late 73, so cold, stripped down sort of set. But Bob very quickly, I think, realized, looking at this script and looking what this content is going to be like, brains being scooped out of craniums and sort of stuff like that they eventually ended up with, didn't they? That he's like, I'm not actually sure I want to direct this. This is a bit too much for me, like too heavy in terms of its content, because it was certainly not played for laughs. There is a lot of black humor in it, but it's not comedy. Bob said, right, I tell you what, I'll produce it instead. And Alan Ormsby and Jeff Gillen, you co-direct it. So that's what happened. So Ormsby and Gillen ended up co-directing it. Bob Clark was there. He was editing Death Dream in a little house on the set, and they were cracking on with filming Deranged in like late 73. And then again, when Bob was seeing the rushes, he stepped back even further and said, actually, do you know what? This effects stuff you're doing here, Tom Savini and Bob, is just so effective. I don't even want my name on this at all. So he said, I will stay on and help, but I'm not going to be listed as a producer on this. Because I think for Bob, Alan was just throwing himself into this and having fun. But I think for Bob, he always had an eye on the career as a filmmaker, the long-term element. Well, what am I going to do after this? And suddenly, if I've got my name all over this film called Confessions of a Necrophiliac, and it's a bloodbath, where do I go from here? Who's going to hire me after this? I don't agree with that. And I'm sure you don't, Mark, as well. Being a horror fan, I think Bob got that wrong. And to be fair, years later, he admitted he got it wrong and said, when you actually step back and look at it, it's a very, very powerful film. He was wrong to sort of disown it. Maybe disown is not the right, because he stayed on board, he helped. Right. But he just said, look, I just don't want my name on this, rather than going out and publicly saying, I hated this. He never did that.
Right.
He just sort of said, right, just don't have my name on this. As I said to you before we went on the air, Bob's quote was, I'm a film director who's made some horror films. I am not a horror film director. He never badmouthed the horror genre, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the be all and end all for him.
We still get that kind of stuff today. People separating themselves from their early horror films.
Yeah, absolutely. Or we get phrases like elevated horror,
right,
being thrown
or thriller.
You get these.
Just call it a thriller.
And certainly for low budget filmmakers, it's an opportunity they wouldn't have otherwise to get into filmmaking, make a quick horror film. They're cheap to make a lot of the time. Bob said the same. He said, when he wanted to become a director, he said he basically had two options because he had no money. It was horror films or porno. Right. And he said he wasn't interested in porno at all. So it's like, right, horror it is then, especially in terms of profit margins and stuff. Well, you think of the most profitable films in history. What are we talking? Blair Witch Project, the original Halloween, these independent films that made an absolute killing, Paranormal Activity, all these films that cost nothing and just absolutely lit up the box office. That didn't happen with Deranged, though. As I say, it pretty much got made and then instantly forgotten about. Limited release at a few drive-ins in February 74. Roberts Blossom, the actor who played Ezra Cobb, who most people will think of as, I can't remember what his character name is, but he's in Home Alone, isn't he? As the sort of, the quote-unquote creepy neighbor. He didn't put it on his CV. He took his name off the film. Again, I think it's very good at what it does. It's not a film I watch over and over again because it's almost too intense in a sort of way. There's no pleasure, if you like. It's incredibly effective and you admire it, but it's not a film I love, if that makes sense.
It definitely is different in tone than the other two movies. that we're talking about. And not that those two movies have the same tone, because one is very serious and one is very funny, but this has that absolutely midnight black humor of it, and it can be overwhelming. I think it's pretty amazing, but like you said, it's not one that I watch over and over again.
It's almost got that documentary style as well, hasn't it? Because you have like the journalist there,
Yes, Les Carlson makes his first appearance.
Yeah, who then turns up in Black Christmas as like the telephone engineer running around the, what do you call them? I don't know what you call that.
Phone bank.
Yeah, the phone bank, plugging his wires in and sort of telling them that it's inside the house. It's played for real, very grimy. It's about as far removed from a Hollywood horror film as you could possibly get. It's downbeat. I think I read somewhere, I think Stephen Thrower, who's like one of these experts on independent cinema and sort of stuff, wrote that like you just couldn't imagine anybody making it today. People just wouldn't bankroll it. Like, well, nobody's going to watch this, so we're not making it. It's one of those things that I often talk about with Bob Clark and Alan is you always talk about these runs of horror movies. Probably John Carpenter is the best, is the way you sort of look and say, right, so you went from like Halloween to The Fog to Escape from New York to this to Christie, and it's like, whoa, that's one hell of a run in terms of like films that you just love. But nobody ever talks about Bob Clark in the early 70s and Alan Ormsby with Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, and then Death Dream, and then Deranged, then Black Christmas. It's like, hang on a second, that's quite a run as well, flitting around genres to subgenres to an extent. But Deranged didn't get forgotten about because it is a very, very powerful film. You have to be in the right mood to watch it, I would sort of say.
So that brings us back around, going backwards in time to Death Dream, which, as I've already mentioned, was filmed pretty close in succession with Children, but came out after Deranged. And we've got Quadrant Films, again, Canadian company, backing the film, I think, based on either the success or just how well Children turned out. Yes. And this is what leads a lot of people, including myself, who has made this mistake, into thinking that Bob Clark was a Canadian filmmaker, because he did utilize that tax credit system.
Yes.
And if I remember correctly, did become a Canadian citizen.
That's a very good, yes, probably people who call him Canadian are quite within their rights to call him Canadian, aren't they? Yeah, the other thing I would add about Quadrant, Mark, is that one of the main guys in Quadrant, I think it was 3 guys, but one of them was an English guy called Peter James, who I'm not sure if you've heard of, but he is a very successful crime novelist. Now, he still churns out a few books every year that become bestsellers over here, and he's had stuff converted into TV series over here. He was somehow working with these couple of Canadian guys and launched Quadrant, and he absolutely loved Bob Clark, loved him. I've interviewed Peter, I interviewed him when I was putting my book together, and he was gushing about how he got on with Bob, because Bob just had this enthusiasm, so when you met him, it was like, well, we can do this, we can do this, we can do this, we can do that. We just need a chance and we just need a bit of money. He was a very good salesman. So suddenly you have Quadrant coming in, giving him 235 grand for a film to say, well, there you go. What have you got? They didn't even really say, well, it needs to be about this or it needs to be about that. They just gave them the money and said, well, come up with an idea for us.
Mm-hmm. And where did the idea for Death Dream come from?
Yeah, the idea had been knocking around with Alan Ormsby for a good number of years. So he had come up with this idea that he originally envisioned as a play, a stage play called The Veteran. So the same sort of idea as Death Dream, Vietnam vet gets killed, his mum can't accept the fact, does this vigil, in effect almost wills him back to life, called, life in quote marks. Mm-hmm. So he wrote it in the 60s. Alan had been working on this using Monkey's Paw. I think there was a Bertolt Brecht play that he used as inspiration. So lots of inspiration, and came up with this thing called The Veteran. And then suddenly when Quadrant came in and said, well, here's $250,000. What have you got? What have you got for us? Bob and Alan were like, well, hang on, what about that script you've got that you were working on? Alan went back and then rewrote a film script based around it called The Night Walker. That was the original title for it. Wrote it in 2 weeks. You can watch it as a straight horror film if you want, or if you want a little bit more meat on the bones, you can look at it and say, this is saying a hell of a lot about the Vietnam War, the treatment of American soldiers coming back from Vietnam, how people came back from Vietnam and how that had affected them. You can read into it so much. And, you know, Bob and Alan both said they weren't going to be banging the drum about, look at the subtext, people, look at the subtext, but it's there, isn't it? You know, it is clearly there. You have this guy, Andy, the son, who comes back almost soulless. He comes back without any emotion because he's been shot, and you know, that we see in the prologue. But the message they're trying to get across is that he's almost been desensitized by what's happened in Vietnam, and this is what was happening across America. You know, with these soldiers coming back, these 18, 19-year-olds coming back ruined sort of mentally because of what happened to them out there, but nobody wanted to talk about it. There's this great scene, isn't there, earlier on in the film where Andy has come back and he's sat out in the garden with the family, and the local postman comes along, who's this World War II vet, and he's banging on about how, oh, you know, the good old days, and you know, about how World War II was great, and we're all celebrated, and it's just a culture clash. Andy decides the best thing he can do is strangle the family's dog to get his frustration out with it. One of the kids in that scene actually is Alan Ormsby's son. So that was what they came up with the script. 2 weeks, A Night Walker. It then became Dead of Night, which was the title it was released under. Most people know it as Death Dream because that's what it was re-released under. I remember when it first came out on DVD, it was released as Death Dream. It had other titles, like The Night Andy Came Home was one, with Whispers, Donors, which I thought was a clever title for the film when you consider, you know, what Andy does to quote unquote stay alive in the film. But I think Alan actually came out and said he doesn't think they've ever come up with the right title for the film, because he said even Death Dream. Well, it's not a dream. Right. You know, it's not a dream, it's happening. So what's Death? What does that mean? You know, what Dead of Night? Well, that okay, but that doesn't really say anything.
And it's been used. How many other movies have that title? This just came to my mind, actually, as you were saying that. I remember reading that, Ormsby's critique of Death Dream. But you could almost take that and turn the movie into something else where, almost Jacob's Ladder-esque, where we have seen the prologue. We know that Andy dies. The rest of the film could be his death dream.
Him dreaming about him coming back home.
Yeah, it's kind of an awful dream.
You're the first person that's raised that as a possibility, Mark. And now, damn you, because it means I'll have to go and watch the film again, which is no hardship, let's be honest. But and say, right, would that actually work as an idea? It may well do. The crazy thing about Death Dream, of course, and you will have spotted this, everybody who's watched Death Dream will have spotted this, is the first thing that throws you in the film is you get the prologue where Andy is shot in Vietnam, some bushes in America somewhere, where he was shot. He comes back, doesn't he? You know, after the candlelit vigil, you know, you're not dead, willing him back. And then he turns up hitchhiking his way back home. And you think, well, hang on a second, that's not the guy I just saw being shot in Vietnam. That's a completely different guy. So who the hell was the guy I saw shot in Vietnam, and what's he got to do with anything? Why that happened was the footage, the Vietnam prologue wasn't in the original cut of the film. They originally, when they were casting for the role of Andy, they had a whole host of people come in for it. Richard Backus obviously got the role. And I think what was brilliant was he said about it, when I interviewed him, he had so many stories, but one of my favorites for him was he said his audition was to come in a room, sit down in a chair and stare angrily at a lampshade without talking and just say, look at that lampshade as though you hate it. And they were like, right, you've got the part, because he did such a good job, because he doesn't talk much in the film, does he? It's mostly stares and physical more than dialogue for him. Mm-hmm. But another guy that tested for the part was an actor called Gary Swanson, who they didn't give the part to. But what happened was they filmed this in autumn 72. Then it started shipping the footage off to Quadrant and editing it and that sort of thing. Quadrant came back and said, well, hang on, we need a bit more here. You know, you're saying that he's shot in Vietnam and died in Vietnam. we want to see him die in Vietnam. So you need to go back and shoot some stuff that's meant to be in Vietnam and put it at the start of the film. And so they were like, right, okay, we can do that. So they had to go back in February 73, a couple of months after they finished, and do these reshoots with this Vietnam footage. But Richard Backus wasn't available. He was working on another project, so they couldn't use him. So they were like, right, well, what can we do here? So almost Plan 9 from Outer Space when Bela Lugosi died style. They go to Gary Swanson and say, well, actually, do you want to be in this film after all? Because if so, you can be Andy in this Vietnam sequence we're doing, where you've basically just got to be shot. And so that's why you would literally have two actors playing the same part, or what's meant to be the same part, purely because it had to be done as a reshoot. So
I don't think I've ever noticed.
If you watch it again, you will.
Yeah,
you know,
now I will, for sure.
When you watch it as many times as I had to do, you know, for the book, I'm thinking,
right.
Oh, who the hell is this meant to be at the start here? Because that's not Richard Backus. So is that a different? Is the person he's falling on Richard? I was just confused by it all. Death Dream is a step up for Bob and Alan. You think suddenly they're going to $250,000 budget. They're getting actors in, like you have John Marley playing the dad, who was in The Godfather, for goodness sake.
Mm-hmm.
And you had Lynn Carlin, who was a well-known actress. Apparently, though, the most popular on set was Henderson Forsyth, who plays the doctor, because he was in like a really popular TV soap opera at the time. So Bob and Alan said whenever they filmed any scenes with Henderson Forsyth, a crowd would turn up to watch, because he was such a celebrity of the time. I think the best scene in the film for me personally is when Richard Backus, or Andy, turns up at his surgery at night, and you have this stalking sequence. Really, it's not a quick kill by any stretch of the imagination. He's stalked, and then Andy comes up with this fantastic line saying, "I died for you, Doc. You need to return the favor." As in, I went to Vietnam and I died the country, sort of thing. And I just think it's a great scene. Alan Ormsby turns up then, if you've spotted him, as like a bystander when the body's being taken out of the thing. And Bob's in it as well. He turns
Bob
up as a
and
police
Jeff
officer.
Gillen.
Yeah, police officer at the end. That was a scene that was cut. I don't know if you've ever seen the extras and stuff like that, because the original ending of it, or one of the endings they got rid of, was the police car bursts into flames. At the end, there's this huge explosion. Goodness knows why they wanted to do that in the first place, but that's not in the final. The print you probably see if you buy it on Blu-ray or whatever, but it's there as a deleted scene, I think. You still had people in there, so like Anya Ormsby, Jane Daly, I think, who was in Children. She was worked at the flower shop in the film. So they were still using Carl Zitra. They were still using this group that they had, but they were able to give it a bit more polish because they had a bit more money to spend, I suppose, really. It was filmed in a town called Brooksville in Florida. So the cemetery was for real. All the locations were for real. Yes, as I touched on earlier, of course, one of the big things that you have to mention when you talk about Death Dream is Tom Savini, because this was his first film that he sort of worked on. And again, that was a strange story how that came about, that Forrest Carpenter, who was just one of the crew on Children and then Death Dream, went into a diner. He was quite a character, this Forrest Carpenter guy, with like an Indiana Jones hat, was how Tom Savini described him. But just sort of got chatting to Tom Savini and was like, "Oh, what are you doing?" "Well, we're here actually making a film called Dead of Night." And "What do you do, Tom?" "Oh, well, I do theater effects, illusions, and I was a photographer in Vietnam." And he's like, "Oh, you do makeup effects, do you?" And Tom just happened to have binders in his car boot with all these photos of makeup that he'd done. And so Forrest was like, "Well, hang on, do you want to just come and work on this film with us? You can help Alan Ormsby with the makeup effects." And as they say, the rest is history. It went from there, because then Tom worked on Deranged and then became the absolute legend that he is.
The one thing that always makes me curious about that story, and I heard it and read it a few times, is why he was in Florida.
I think he was doing some theatre stuff or school stuff, and he would tour around doing these little shows, wouldn't he? I think it came up again when there was that Tom Savini documentary not so long ago, wasn't there, where it gets mentioned. I think we just have to chalk it up as a happy coincidence.
Yeah, that's
because it's
amazing.
If he didn't meet that guy in a diner and then hadn't worked with Bob Clark and Alan on Death Dream, would he have even become the Tom Savini we know? Who knows? good chance it wouldn't have happened. Death Dream is such an underappreciated is the wrong word, because it bugs me when people say underappreciated. I always prefer underseen.
Yes.
Because I think the people who have seen Death Dream love it, and know how good it is. It's just not enough people have seen it. That's the thing. And Death Dream was, again, a one that had a poor release. It actually had a world premiere, incredibly, in Tampa in August 74. And John Marley was there. And, so that was quite a glitzy thing. It must have been amazing for Bob Clark, to have this premiere. But again, it just never went anywhere. It didn't succeed. It didn't make money. It didn't even play in New York until 2000, when it was shown at this festival, with, what about this film that never made it here? But then suddenly we have the beauty of VHS, DVD, and Blu-ray, and suddenly people start to appreciate it, still not enough. People always talk about Night of the Living Dead and the allegories, and Romero with his political statements through horror films. And it's like, well, you'd be hard pushed to find one that gives you as much political statement as Death Dream. I think you really would. And the ending is incredible. I don't want to spoil these things just in case people haven't seen it. The ending is a real about turn. You feel sorry for the person who's meant to be the villain in the film. And it's effective because of that. It's just a great, great film. Again, I wish people would talk about it more. One of my prized possessions is I actually have the drive-in one sheet for Dead of Night, which is this effective blue and yellow poster, one of these. If you're not in for the first 10 minutes, we're not letting you in. I love it. And I just hope over the years, hopefully it'll pick up more of an audience somewhere. I think it's streaming probably at the moment, isn't it? Somewhere. I imagine it's probably on.
Yeah. Last time I watched it, it was on Tubi, which is sort of a great free service here. And I don't know if you guys have it over there. But
it doesn't exist over here, unfortunately. Not that I'm aware of anyway.
It's free with ads, but they get a really great selection of horror films. And I believe that Children and Death Dream are both on there. That's where I watched them last. It's interesting because this was one of the first films to honestly portray the trauma of the Vietnam War, but it kind of goes back to the whole Twilight Zone thing. You can wrap it in a fantasy story, either sci-fi or horror, and get it put out there. And the subtext, it's definitely there. And obviously it was intended to be there. This isn't sort of a happenstance thing where maybe it was a World War II story instead to represent Vietnam. No, this kid was in Vietnam, got killed there, came back. He's basically addicted, as many of them were when they came back. So you have all that. It's all there. But also it's a really intelligent horror movie. And I think that's the thing that kind of threw me off the first time I watched it. It wasn't an immediate favorite of mine. I think it had something to do with the fact that it was intelligently made.
Very subtle, isn't it? I mean, it's only really when you get Andy really starts deteriorating, and then they have that crazy scene at the drive-in theater in the cars where it starts to suddenly, now we're into a bit of exploitation here. But before that, it's so almost kitchen sink drama at times, with the mother and the father arguing about how do we deal with him, what's happened to him, the girlfriend who I don't even recognize you anymore. Who is this that's come back? That's sort of that's what I mean. You can watch it however you want to watch it. That's what's great. And, Bob and Alan were both very open about that, and they said they weren't criticizing the soldiers that had gone to Vietnam at all. They were criticizing the war. They had nothing against the soldiers because they thought how they'd been treated was disgraceful. But it was the war they had a problem with. But they didn't want to bash you over the head with it. It was clearly there if you wanted to see it. But if you just wanted to see a horror film about a guy who comes back and basically has to inject himself with blood to stay alive, you can watch it as that. I love Death Dream. I love recommending Death Dream to people. Children shouldn't play with dead things. You can argue is a bit more of an acquired taste. So there's certain people I could give children shouldn't play with dead things to. And I think, well, they might even turn off in that first hour because they're expecting this zombie apocalypse. Whereas Death Dream, I love showing it to people, and just saying, right, what did you think of that then? They're like stunned by it. I said a lot of the time. I'm glad we're talking about it now, Mark, because if it means one other person goes and watches it and digs it up somewhere, then brilliant.
Because that's sort of the whole point of doing all this and giving attention to, like you said, I think 3 underseen movies. And it's curious because I've known about them for decades, and that was really only because of the Psychotronic Encyclopedia film.
Okay, yeah.
They weren't available to me. They were on my watch list for years. It's been nice the last 10 years or so to actually have been able to watch them. And
it's amazing, isn't it, when you can suddenly see these films that you just heard about in the mists of time, and then suddenly they're getting some 4K Blu-ray release. I mean, it's an amazing time to be a horror fan. You know, regardless of what genre or directors or films you like, it's just incredible time that you're, you know, I mean, yeah, the children version I've got that I sat and watched last night is in HD. This is a film that played drive-ins in 1972, and suddenly you're watching it on pristine. Sometimes that detracts from the drive-in element of the film. You know, sometimes you want that grindhouse feel for a film, don't you? But it's still amazing that they're getting this treatment, you know, from these companies, the Arrows, the Vinegar Syndromes, the Severins. Long may that continue.